What if the Emperor was never born? Imagine a galaxy where the light of mankind was extinguished before it could ever rise a reality, where the most powerful mind to have ever lived never drew breath, no guiding hand, no unifying vision, no eternal beacon shining through the madness of the warp. Only silence, chaos, and the slow decay of a species destined to devour itself. In this forbidden imagining, Earth Terra never knew the one who would become the Emperor. The immortal guardian of humanity was never conceived in the darkness of ancient times, never walked among kings and killers, never shaped the path that led our species toward the stars. Without him, humanity's story did not become legend, it became tragedy. The old night fell far sooner. The age of strife, that era of war, mutation, and madness arrived centuries earlier, unopposed and uncontained. The psychic awakening of mankind tore open the veil between reality and the warp like a festering wound. Across the void, billions of human worlds screamed as demons poured through the cracks of their souls. On Terra, empires rose and collapsed in a single breath. City-states armed with ancient machines slaughtered each other in endless wars for resources long since turned to ash. The sky was red with dust, the oceans black with oil, and faith had long been replaced by despair. There was no unification war, no golden warrior king to end the petty squabbles of the techno-barbarian lords. Instead, the rulers of Terra became mad prophets and cybernetic tyrants, each declaring themselves the savior of mankind while burning millions alive to prove it. Some turned to the warp for power, becoming vessels of daemons. Others dug beneath the crust of the planet, resurrecting abominations of pre-imperial science god machines without conscience, fueled by the souls of the dying. The once proud cradle of humanity became a tomb of rust and blood. And without the Emperor, Mars remained isolated, its mechanicum degenerating into cults that worshipped the machine as a living god. They no longer built, they only prayed, their hands trembling before relics they could not understand. The sacred STC fragments, the blueprints of humanity's greatest achievements, were forgotten, or worse, rewritten by the whispers of the warp. The galaxy that once awaited conquest now recoiled in terror, for mankind had no master, no protector, and no unity. The first psychers, wild, untrained, terrified, became living portals for the entities lurking beyond. A child on Calth might awaken with the power to burn cities with a thought, only to burst into flame as a daemon took her flesh. On Necromunda, hive towers became shrines of possession, their inhabitants screaming praises to unseen gods. And on countless frontier worlds, human colonies disappeared overnight, their signals replaced by the droning chant of something ancient and hateful. Without the Astronomican, the Emperor's divine beacon, warp travel became madness incarnate. The void roots twisted, folded, and devoured the vessels that dared to cross them. Fleets vanished, their navigators driven insane by the ever-shifting tides of unreality. The galaxy became a prison of lightless distance. Humanity, once spread across the stars, was trapped, isolated pockets of terrified survivors surrounded by nightmares both alien and divine. In the absence of a single emperor, humanity created 1,000 false ones. Entire star systems crowned their own god-kings, each promising deliverance. Some were charlatans who enslaved billions. Others were genuine visionaries who burned too brightly and were consumed by the warp they sought to master. And so, from the ashes of a united dream rose 1,000 cults, 1,000 heresies, each tearing at the soul of mankind. The Xenos saw their chance. The Eldar, already on the edge of their own damnation, preyed upon fragmented human worlds for sport and sacrifice. The Orcs swarmed across the void unchecked. Their endless wars now fought against the defenseless remnants of mankind. Even the Necrons began to stir, their tomb worlds awakening to find the galaxy ripe for harvest. Without the Emperor's legions to challenge them, humanity became nothing more than prey, a fading echo in a galaxy of predators. And deep within the warp, the Chaos Gods laughed, for without the Emperor's will to contain them, humanity's collective fear and hatred became their greatest feast. Khorne drank from the oceans of human blood spilled by warlords who knew no restraint. Nurgle gifted his plagues to those who begged for mercy. Slaanesh whispered ecstasy into the dying breaths of kings. And Tzeentch smiled, for the grand game had begun without opposition. In this reality, The name man became a curse whispered by the stars. Entire worlds burned offerings to false divinities, crying out for salvation that would never come. The void itself shimmered with the ghosts of human fleets lost to the abyss. Somewhere on a forgotten moon, a lone priest built an altar of bone and prayed for a savior who would never arrive. His words vanished into the static, carried by the cold winds of eternity. But perhaps somewhere, in a hidden corner of this doomed timeline, there were still those who remembered. Ancient scribes who spoke of a dream, a figure who might have been, a savior that history itself had erased. They called him the unborn emperor, a myth of golden light, a legend of what might have been. They built statues to him from memory they never had, praying to a void that did not answer. And yet, in the darkest corners of the warp, something stirred. Not a man, not a god, but the faint echo of what should have been a will so powerful that even non-existence could not silence it. The chaos gods felt it, a tremor in the fabric of their dominion. For even in a universe where he never lived, the idea of the emperor, the concept of human unity, sacrifice, and defiance refused to die. The echo was enough to frighten them. The great powers of chaos turned their gaze toward Terra, fearing that even in absence, his potential might awaken. And so, they sent their legions, daemons, cults, and possessed kings to scour every trace of his possibility. Worlds burned, souls were devoured, hope itself was hunted like prey. The galaxy drowned in its own sin. But in the silence that followed, among the ruins of shattered humanity, a single phrase endured, whispered by the dying, carved into the walls of derelict ships, sung by madmen staring into the void. He should have been born. No empire rose, no god-emperor reigned, only the echo of destiny unrealized, a universe devoured by the consequence of absence. In this grimdark imagining, humanity was never united because it was never worthy of unity. Without the emperor, mankind was nothing but a reflection of its own chaos, and the stars, once symbols of hope, became a vast and empty graveyard of forgotten prayers. This is the world without him, a galaxy without light, a future without salvation. And somewhere, in the endless dark between stars, the warp laughs, for this is the universe where the emperor was never born. In this universe where the emperor was never born, the galaxy fell into a chaos so vast that even the warp seemed to weep. Terra, cradle of mankind, became a wasteland of fire and machine, its surface carved open by endless war. Mountains of steel rose where oceans once shimmered, and the air was thick with ash, incense, and the smell of oil-burned flesh. There were no nations, no unity, no vision of destiny, only tribes of cyber-barbarians locked in eternal struggle. Each tribe believed itself chosen. Some worshipped the machine as god, welding flesh and metal together until their bodies became crude mockeries of the holy Adeptus Mechanicus that never came to be. Others turned inward, offering their minds to the warp, becoming living conduits for daemons that promised power in exchange for damnation. Children were born with psychic mutations, glowing eyes, black veins, whispers in their skulls. Those who survived were crowned prophets or slaughtered as witches. Without the emperor's guiding will, no unification wars ever brought order. Terra never became the throne world. It became a tomb world, a rotting engine of superstition and madness. The once sacred Himalaysian vaults, where the emperor would have built his hidden laboratories, were instead the lairs of techno-necromancers who harvested human souls to feed dying reactors. The skies above shimmered with auroras of psychic discharge, and the seas boiled under the weight of centuries of pollution and blood. Beyond Terra, humanity's colonies in the void faced even greater horror. The first long-range warp drives, crude, experimental relics of the dark age of technology, became death sentences. Ships vanished in transit, their hulls twisting into knots of bone and metal as the warp swallowed them whole. Those few that emerged were changed, their crews eyeless, skins stretched tight, speaking in tongues that belonged to no mortal world. Some of these cursed vessels drifted forever, broadcasting endless sermons of despair into the cosmos. The Mechanicum of Mars, isolated and terrified, retreated into its forges, cutting all contact with Terra. Without the Emperor's diplomacy and vision, Mars fell into civil war. Tech priests split into heretical sects, each claiming communion with the true machine god. They waged holy war with plasma and data viruses, erasing entire forges from existence. The red planet became a pulsing wound in the void, its atmosphere filled with smoke, its surface crawling with half-living automata. The Omnissiah never came, and so Mars forgot how to build, how to think, how to dream. On distant human worlds, the story was no different. Without the imperial truth, faith fractured into a million cults. Some worlds worshipped ancient heroes of the Dark Age, others made idols of their dead machines. On one planet, an AI warlord ruled for 1,000 years, turning its people into numbered data slaves. On another, a psychic queen promised her followers eternal peace, until the warp tore her soul apart and remade her into a daemon thing crowned with bone and fire. Every colony believed itself the last bastion of humanity, and everyone was wrong. The warp storms grew thicker. They tore through the galaxy like open arteries, isolating worlds, severing trade routes, and trapping fleets in spirals of unreality. Mankind's empire of stars, the one that once might have been decayed before it could ever exist. In this void of leadership, chaos reigned. Daemons walked freely among mortals, masquerading as prophets, kings, and saviors. Entire civilizations fell to the worship of false gods. There was no holy terror to unite them, no golden throne to channel psychic power into light, no Astronomican blazing through the darkness. Humanity was blind. Warp navigation became guesswork and madness. Navigators, born with their third eyes open to the immaterium, screamed until they clawed them out. Fleets disappeared into nothingness. The warp itself fed on the terror of lost souls, expanding like a cancer that devoured time and memory. On the few worlds that survived, remnants of human scientists, broken heirs of the ancient Federation, tried to preserve knowledge. They built archives of glass and data, guarded by machines that still remembered loyalty. But as centuries passed, even these archives became myths. Their protectors forgot their purpose. Machines began to worship their creators, building temples of code and circuits, chanting prayers in binary hymns. Humanity's intellect, once its greatest weapon, turned inward and consumed itself. The alien empires took notice. The Eldar, long, decadent, and nearing their own doom, saw the collapse of mankind as a cosmic jest. They plundered human colonies for slaves, twisting mortal flesh into living art. They whispered that humans had never deserved their spark, that their weakness was the proof of their insignificance. The orcs, drawn by the smell of endless war, descended in waves, their laughter echoing across ruined worlds. Each battle fed their joy, each conquest fueling more destruction. The Necrons awoke in silence, observing from beneath the tomb worlds, waiting for the stars to grow dim enough to claim once more. But the most horrifying of all were the gods of the warp, for without the Emperor's psychic presence to balance their power, their dominion grew boundless. Khorne's rage infected every human conflict. Nurgle's gifts spread like wildfire, turning entire populations into shuffling, laughing corpses. Tzientch twisted the last remnants of human reason into paranoid madness. Slaanesh whispered to the desperate and the lonely, offering pleasure to those who had forgotten what joy was. The human soul, once the brightest spark in the galaxy, became the favorite prey of the ruinous powers. Every prayer, every cry, every dream fed them. The warp was no longer a reflection of humanity's potential, it was their graveyard. In the shadows of dead worlds, rumors persisted of a different fate. Some whispered that the Emperor had been born, but slain in infancy, that his spirit still wandered the warp, chained and silent. Others claimed he had never existed at all, that mankind's myths had simply invented him to soothe the terror of being alone in an uncaring cosmos. Both tales led to the same truth. Without him, there was no purpose, no unity, no dawn. And yet, deep within the warp's roiling storm, something flickered. Not light, not hope, but memory. The idea of him, the Golden Guardian, the father of humanity, lingered like an ember that refused to die. Even in universes where he was never born, his absence was a presence. The very void seemed to remember the shape of what should have been. Across the ruins of 1,000 worlds, mad prophets spoke of dreams filled with golden light. Soldiers dying in trenches saw visions of a man crowned in fire. Children born with strange marks on their skin spoke of a voice that called them to unity. None knew its name, none could explain its origin, but they all felt the same truth echoing through their blood. He should have been. The warp howled at this defiance. Daemons tore apart the seers who spoke of the unborn emperor, silencing their tongues. But their words had already spread. Whispers became prayers, prayers became faith, faith became rebellion. Perhaps it was nothing, just the final hallucination of a dying species, or perhaps even the absence of the emperor was a seed of his inevitable return. In the darkest corners of the galaxy, where time had no meaning, the idea of the emperor unformed, unborn, began to take shape. A storm within the storm, a thought that refused to be forgotten. The gods watched in silence, uneasy for the first time in eternity, for even they could feel it, that faint pulse, that impossible rhythm in the warp's heart. It was not light, but something older, something purer. It was defiance itself. And so the galaxy trembled, because in a universe where the emperor was never born, something was trying to remember how to dream of him. The galaxy had forgotten what dawn looked like. For millennia, the stars burned cold, indifferent witnesses to the ruin of mankind. In the absence of the emperor, time itself seemed to rot. Centuries bled into one another, until history became a myth, whispered by the mad, the tale of a species that once dreamed of order and was devoured by its own chaos. Terra, once the cradle of humanity, was now nothing more than a scarred corpse of metal and dust. The continents were bound together by rivers of molten slag, its skies burned in permanent twilight. The few who still lived there did not remember they were human. Their languages had dissolved into static chants, their cities into shrines of despair. Entire generations were born in the shadow of god machines that no longer moved, worshipping the silence of their cold engines. They carved prayers into their own skin, believing that pain might awaken the forgotten gods who had abandoned them. There were no governments, no laws, only cults and kings who claimed divine blood. Some wore the skulls of their enemies as crowns, others fed their people to machines that promised immortality. 1,000 faiths bloomed in the ashes, each promising salvation through sacrifice. And through them all, one question haunted every mind that could still dream. Why were we left alone? Out among the stars, the ruins of human colonies drifted like ghosts. Once great hive worlds, now silent and skeletal, orbited dead suns. Vessels filled with mummified crews floated between systems, their course unchanged for centuries. The remnants of human civilization were scattered across the galaxy, fragments of a species that had once reached for the divine, now forgotten even by the stars. The surviving fragments of Mars's mechanicum became nightmares of their own making. Without the Emperor's guiding hand, the tech priests descended into full-blown madness. Their flesh had long been replaced by machinery, their minds fragmented into infinite data loops of prayer and pain. They worshipped the machine not as symbol, but as a living god that demanded blood and circuitry alike. They began to build things that should never have existed, self-replicating servitors made from human souls, colossal war engines powered by bound psychers whose screams became hymns. Their faith became a virus that spread to the stars, infecting every surviving colony that still remembered electricity. Meanwhile, the warp boiled. It was no longer a mirror to the mortal realm, it was the mortal realm. The boundary between the two had collapsed. The galaxy itself was bleeding into unreality. Storms of pure emotion consumed entire systems. Entire planets disappeared into crimson fog, only to reappear centuries later as warped caricatures of life. The daemons of chaos ruled openly, feeding on the despair of mankind like wolves gorging on a dying herd. The strongest among them wore the skins of human saints, mocking the hope that once defied them. In this nightmare, humanity was no longer the dominant species. The orcs reigned supreme across the void, their endless wars unchallenged. They built empires of scrap and fire, spreading from one world to another like green wildfire. Each victory fueled their hunger for more, and without the Imperium's armies to contain them, there was no end in sight. The Eldar, twisted by their own hubris, watched from the shadows. They were ancient, fading, but not yet gone. Some pitied humanity, others delighted in its collapse. The craft worlds, haunted by their psychic echoes, whispered of the age of silence, when mankind's flame finally died. To them, it was justice, the punishment for a race that had dared to imitate gods. Yet even in this desolation, whispers persisted. They came from dreamers, madmen, and children born under blood-red skies. They spoke of visions of a man of light walking across the wastes of terror, his face hidden, his eyes burning like twin suns. They called him by 1,000 names, the unborn king, the forgotten father, the light that never came. Each tale was different, but all shared one truth. He was searching for something, searching for us. In the warp, these whispers began to converge. The Chaos Gods felt at first a faint vibration beneath the endless storm. It was not power, it was remembrance. A collective yearning that defied the very laws of their domain. Billions of human souls, scattered and broken, were beginning to remember what it meant to hope. It was faint, a flicker of will, unshaped, unbidden, but it was enough to make the gods uneasy. Khorne's rage faltered, Nurgle's laughter dimmed, Slaanesh paused mid-ecstasy, and Tzeentch, the great schemer, turned his infinite gaze toward the heart of the warp. There, amid the chaos, something impossible was forming, not a being, but an idea. The raw will of mankind, coalescing around the echo of a soul that had never lived. The warp screamed, reality trembled, the galaxy convulsed as the immaterial took form. It was not the Emperor, not yet. But it was what would have been, the shadow of destiny, clawing its way into existence through memory alone. It had no flesh, no throne, no name, but it radiated purpose. And in that moment, across 1,000 ruined worlds, the forgotten remnants of humanity felt it. On a dying world where ash covered the seas, a dying soldier stood from the corpses of his comrades and looked to the sky. He did not know why. But he dropped his weapon and whispered a prayer, words he had never learned, in a language long dead. On another world, a child born blind began to see golden light through her eyelids and cried tears of blood. On Mars, the oldest of the machine priests fell to his knees, trembling as his systems overloaded. His dying words, the Omnissiah, was real. The warp howled. Daemons turned on one another in panic, for the memory of the Emperor, unspoken, unborn, but undeniable, burned them like holy fire. The Chaos Gods unleashed their fury, desperate to smother the spark before it became flame. Worlds erupted, stars collapsed, and time itself twisted into knots. But it was too late. Something had awakened. Not in the flesh, not in the warp, but in the soul of mankind. For even in a universe where he was never born, the Emperor's will could not be erased. It had always been part of humanity's essence, the drive to rise, to endure, to defy the gods themselves. And as the galaxy screamed in the agony of rebirth, the faintest whisper echoed through every corner of existence. A voice, without body, without name, yet heavy with sorrow and command. Mankind, rise. For the first time in 10,000 years, the warp trembled not from chaos, but from something greater, something that even the gods feared. And in that trembling, the forgotten promise of humanity was reborn. The promise that even without the Emperor's birth, his spirit, the spirit of defiance, could never truly die. The warp had never known fear. For countless aeons it had feasted upon the screams of mortals, reshaping time, thought, and flesh according to its monstrous whim. But now, within its shifting tides, something stirred that the gods themselves did not understand, an echo, faint yet unyielding, that refused to be devoured. It began as a whisper, barely a thought, flickering through the minds of dying men, a memory of something that had never existed, the image of a golden figure standing against the storm, the echo of command not in words but in certainty, rise. And for the first time, the warp hesitated. Across the galaxy, humanity broken, scattered, and dying felt that hesitation. On a forsaken mining world consumed by plague, a group of infected workers fell to their knees and began to sing, their rotting throats forming a hymn no one had taught them. On a derelict void ship adrift for centuries, the mummified crew suddenly twitched, and in unison, their withered hands formed the sign of the Aquila, though none had ever known its meaning. On Terra itself, the dead heart of mankind, the ash shifted in the wind. A single statue, half buried for millennia, cracked open under invisible strain. The face within was serene. Its eyes were closed, but something behind them was waking. The gods of chaos turned their gaze toward the mortal plane, their forms rippling in fury. Khorne's brass citadels bled molten rage. Rivers of blood boiled dry in his anger. He was never born, the blood god thundered. He cannot rise. Nurgle's garden withered under his frown, his laughter turning into a guttural cough. Even rot fears what does not die, he muttered, clutching his diseased heart. Slaanesh screamed with a voice like broken glass, the sound of pleasure collapsing into pain. They remember beauty, they remember him. And in the labyrinthine mind of Tsiench, a new paradox was born, a prophecy that should have been impossible. For how could destiny resist its own erasure? The warp convulsed. Its storms grew violent, reality flickering like a dying star. The gods sent forth their armies, legions of daemons forged from nightmare and madness. They poured into real space through psychic fractures, seeking to extinguish the spark of remembrance before it became flame. Every whisper of the unborn emperor was hunted, every prayer silenced by fire. Worlds burned by the millions. Yet still, the whisper spread. The more chaos sought to destroy it, the stronger it became. Each act of cruelty, each world consumed, each soul damned, all of it became fuel for the growing will that defied the gods. For deep within humanity's essence lay the truth the warp had always feared, that suffering does not destroy faith, it creates it. The forgotten remnants of humanity began to stir. Among the ruins of Terra, scavenger tribes who had worshipped the machine idols now spoke of a golden spirit who would free them from the bondage of false gods. On Mars, a dying Magos connected his neural core to an ancient data altar, downloading the final fragment of an STC file. It contained no blueprints, no weapon, only a message: humanity shall endure. In the shadow of a dying star, a blind girl who had never seen the light lifted her face to the void and whispered, "I see him." All across the galaxy, these small awakenings resonated through the warp like heartbeats. Each one was insignificant, a candle in an infinite storm, but together they formed a rhythm, a pulse, a pattern. And in the heart of the immaterium, something vast began to take shape. It was not a man, not yet. It was the idea of one, a silhouette made of light, built from every memory, every prayer, every act of defiance that mankind had ever performed. It was the Emperor, reborn not in flesh, but in concept. A dream too powerful to die, even in a universe where he never existed. The Chaos Gods screamed, for they understood now that their dominion had always depended on his absence. Without him, humanity had fed them endlessly, but if even the idea of him could awaken, then his true birth might be inevitable. So they struck first. The warp descended upon Terra with all its fury. The skies bled. The oceans rose in towers of screaming souls. The ground split open, revealing veins of molten hatred. From the fractures crawled daemons of every kind, greater, lesser, grotesque beyond imagining. They tore through the remnants of mankind's tribes, reducing the cradle of humanity to a single continent of fire and ruin. At the center of this devastation, the statue, the one that had cracked open days before, shattered completely. From its ruins emerged a figure of pure radiance, not flesh but essence. It was faceless, voiceless, and incomplete, a ghost made of belief. But when the daemons saw it, they faltered. Their laughter died in their throats. The figure raised no weapon. It spoke no word. Yet every daemon that approached turned to ash. Every plague wilted. Every scream became silence. For within that form of light burned the sum of all that mankind had lost: courage, reason, compassion, wrath, and unbroken will. It was the Emperor that should have been the culmination of what humanity was always meant to become. The warp recoiled, but its fury was infinite. The gods poured forth their avatars, tearing reality apart to smother the newborn light. And the battle that followed was not fought with armies or weapons, but with faith and memory. Humanity, scattered across the stars, began to dream the same dream of golden fire banishing the dark. Each dream became a weapon, each prayer a shield, each act of sacrifice another spark of his rebirth. Terror burned for 7 days and 7 nights. When the flames at last subsided, the planet was gone, but the warp storm that had consumed it was silent, and from its center radiated a faint, steady light. Across the galaxy, psychers screamed and fell to their knees. Navigators looked to the void and saw a shimmer, a thread of gold cutting through the madness of the warp. For the first time in uncounted millennia, direction existed again. The Astronomican, not the Emperor's beacon, but the memory of it had ignited. And though no one yet knew its name, the galaxy whispered one truth in unison, as if remembering a prophecy that had never been written. He was never born, yet he has returned. The galaxy held its breath. From the black ocean of the warp, where madness reigned and gods feasted upon despair, a single light now shimmered faint, trembling, but unmistakably human. It was not the Emperor, as history once knew him, for history in this reality had been erased. It was something deeper, older, and far more primal, the embodiment of mankind's refusal to die. That light, small as a candle at first, began to stretch across the void. It illuminated worlds that had not seen hope in 100 centuries. It burned through the whispers of chaos, searing the lies that had bound humanity for so long. And as it spread, something extraordinary began to happen. Humanity remembered. On Terra's ruins, where no life had drawn breath for millennia, survivors crawled from the ash. They spoke in broken tongues, yet somehow understood one another. Their dreams were filled with golden visions, a figure walking through fire, surrounded by shadows that could not touch him. They called him the Eternal Flame, the Forgotten Emperor, the Light Reborn. They did not know his name, but they knew his meaning, and that was enough. The warp trembled at this act of remembering. It twisted and contorted, vomiting forth legions of daemons in desperate retaliation. The chaos gods roared across their dominions, uniting in a single purpose. The light must die before it takes form. But each attempt to smother it only strengthened the memory. Each act of destruction, each desecration of human life, became another reason for the light to grow. Suffering had become its foundation, defiance its shape, for even when broken, humanity refused to forget. On Mars, the last surviving Magi gathered before the shattered temples of the machine. Their data shrines flickered to life for the first time in 10,000 years. Amid static and fire, an ancient phrase appeared across their hololith's words in a language older than memory. From the dust of extinction, the Maker shall rise again. On Kalth, where the seas were made of poison and the sky bled red, a colony of feral humans built a cathedral from the bones of dead titans. They did not know why they built it, nor whom they worshipped, but their chants echoed through the warp like the tolling of ancient bells. On a void ship adrift between dying suns, a lone navigator opened her third eye and saw something that made her weep. The stars had aligned into the shape of a two-headed eagle, the sign of unity long forgotten. And so it began not a crusade of armies, but a crusade of faith. Every scattered remnant of mankind began to feel the same, pull a call that transcended planets, cultures, and time itself. They gathered in secret across ruined worlds, guided by dreams, visions, and impossible coincidences. They did not know who led them. They only knew that they must go toward the light. In the depths of the warp, the chaos gods trembled. Never before had they faced something born not of creation, but of absence, a will forged entirely from what should have been. They unleashed their greatest horrors. Warp storms that devoured suns, plague fleets that blackened whole sectors, psychic contagions that turned hope into madness. But for every world lost, 2 more ignited with faith. For every prophet slain, 10 more rose. Humanity, fractured beyond measure, had found a single rhythm again, beating in defiance of eternity. On the edge of the galaxy, a nameless world burned with golden fire. Its surface was scorched, its mountains shattered, its seas turned to molten glass, yet from its core pulsed that same impossible light. There, something vast and formless began to take shape. It was not flesh, not even spirit, but intention. A consciousness woven from memory, pain, and love. The unborn emperor was becoming real not through divine birth or technology, but through collective will. Every prayer, every sacrifice, every moment of human endurance was merging into him. The warp shrieked in agony, The gods turned upon one another, unable to decide how to kill what had no form. Khorne's rage burned the realms of battle itself. Nurgle's garden rotted to ash. Slanesh's laughter dissolved into silence. And Tzeentch, for the first time in eternity, found a paradox he could not solve. Because what humanity had created was beyond chaos, beyond destiny, beyond even death. He did not exist, yet he was. He had no body, yet he moved. He had no voice, yet the entire galaxy heard. The light coalesced into the shape of a man, not perfect, not divine, but human tall, cloaked in radiant flame, his face obscured by shadow. His eyes were voids of gold. When he stepped forward, the warp itself recoiled. Worlds torn apart by daemonic fire began to stabilize. Warp storms calmed, souls long lost found their way home. And then, he spoke not with words, but through the hearts of every living being descended from man. You remember me, though I never was. You believed in me, though you had no reason to. You made me real. Now rise not as slaves, but as what you were meant to be. Across the galaxy, mankind rose. The weak stood, the mad were silenced, the forgotten remembered their names. A spark of unity, the very thing that the true emperor once forged through conquest now burned, naturally, freely, without chains. The gods screamed, their dominions cracked. For the first time, chaos felt something that had no name, not hatred, not hunger, but doubt. The unborn emperor lifted his hand, and a wave of golden light washed through the immaterium. It did not destroy, it simply reminded. The warp, shaped for eons by human corruption, began to bend back toward balance. On worlds that had long fallen to ruin, children were born without mutation. On ships drifting through endless void, lost signals began to find each other. Hope, the rarest of human luxuries, became contagious. And yet, even as this rebirth spread, the unborn emperor remained silent. He looked across the stars, not in triumph, but in sorrow. He saw what humanity had endured in his absence. He saw what it had become and what it could have been. He did not smile. He did not weep. He simply whispered into the endless dark. This was your test, and your curse. Then, as quietly as he had come, he faded, leaving only his light behind. It spread across the void, infinite and eternal, not as a god's dominion, but as a reminder that even in a universe where the emperor was never born, humanity would always remember how to stand. And somewhere, deep within the dying heart of the warp, the gods watched that light and trembled, for they knew this truth. Even without his birth, the dream of the emperor had already begun to conquer them. The light had no source, yet it spread. It moved like breath through the cold lungs of the galaxy, touching every ruin, every grave, every drifting echo of mankind's past. It did not blaze like a star, nor conquer like a fire. It simply was a soft, golden radiance that neither the warp nor time itself could smother. For a moment, an eternal moment, the galaxy was silent. Daemons froze mid-scream, warp storms paused, their chaotic tides holding still as if listening. Even the gods of chaos, those endless, immortal hungers, drew back to watch, wary and uncertain. Humanity had changed. They were no longer united by empire or fear, but by something far more dangerous to chaos: remembrance. On a scorched moon once ruled by warlords, a mother told her starving child a story she could not possibly know, of a man wreathed in light who had stood before the darkness and dared to command it to kneel. On a derelict station orbiting a dead sun, a priest of rust carved the sign of the double-headed eagle into the steel with trembling hands, whispering, "He has no name, yet I remember him." Across countless worlds, the broken fragments of humanity began to rebuild, not for conquest, not for dominion, but for meaning. It was as if the soul of mankind had exhaled after 10,000 years of suffocating despair. The Chaos Gods, watching from their thrones of ruin, were not idle. Khorne's voice rolled like thunder. "Let them bleed again, let them remember war, and the light will fade." Nurgle answered with a wheezing laugh. "They will cling to hope, and hope rots. I will turn their joy to decay." Slanesh hissed, "They will worship the idea as they worship their emperor. Desire will corrupt what defiance built." But Tzeentch said nothing. For the first time, His ever-turning mind was silent. He could see the shape of every future except one, the one now forming before his eyes. Because this light was not destiny, it was choice. It did not demand faith, nor promise salvation. It simply reminded humanity of what they were capable of becoming. On Terra, now nothing but a burnt sphere of glass and ash, the winds carried whispers through the ruins of dead cathedrals. The ground pulsed faintly with gold beneath the soot, as if the planet itself remembered the warmth of his presence. From the dust, new life began to grow small, fragile, but undeniably alive. The unborn emperor was gone, but his echo endured. It was not a ruler's command, nor a god's decree. It was the memory of defiance itself. And that was enough to tilt the balance. Warp storms across the Segmentum Pacificus began to weaken. Astropaths long blind opened their minds and saw glimpses of golden pathways threading through the immaterium. Ships once thought lost began to reappear, their crews unchanged, though they had sailed through the warp for what felt like minutes while millennia had passed outside. For the first time since humanity's fall, navigation was possible again, not by machine or daemon, but by will. The human soul itself had become a compass. But this new dawn carried a price. The gods of chaos could not destroy the light, but they could twist it. They whispered to those who still longed for power, telling them they were the true inheritors of the unborn emperor's dream. On one world, a warlord declared himself the vessel of the golden spirit and crucified his own followers in his name. On another, a cult of purity burned entire cities, proclaiming that the light must be preserved through blood. For humanity had always been both creator and destroyer, even of its own miracles. The warp laughed not because it had won, but because it understood. The emperor's rebirth, even as idea, was a paradox that would forever tear at the boundary between faith and corruption. But among the stars, beyond the noise, there were those who saw the truth. A brotherhood of wanderers, descendants of soldiers, priests, and scientists, gathered aboard a colossal derelict vessel. They called themselves the Keepers of the Echo. They did not worship the unborn emperor, nor deny him. They simply carried his story, ensuring that it would never again be forgotten. Their leader, an ancient astropath blinded by light, recorded the only surviving message ever received through the newborn Astronomican. Do not seek me in the heavens. Do not build my throne again. I am in the courage of those who rise when all else falls. Guard that courage, and you guard me. That message spread quietly, seed by seed, across the recovering sectors. It was not empire that grew from it, but resilience. Humanity learned to navigate the warp with discipline instead of superstition, to rebuild technology without forgetting compassion, to speak of faith not as chains, but as remembrance. Still, the gods did not sleep. They whispered, they tempted, they waited. For the warp has patience beyond measure, and every light casts a shadow. Yet the galaxy had shifted forever. The balance that had been broken since the dawn of time was beginning to right itself not through divine dominance, but through human endurance. And somewhere within the immaterial deep, where gods and memories intertwined, the unborn emperor watched not as a sovereign, but as a witness. He saw mankind crawl from its tombs, reaching once more toward the stars. Uncertain, imperfect, defiant. He saw daemons recoil from prayers whispered not out of fear, but of gratitude. He saw the warp itself reshaped, not by command, but by choice. And though he would never walk among them, though he would never be born into flesh, he smiled not in triumph, but in peace. For in the end, he understood. He had never needed to exist for humanity to rise. The dream was enough. And so the golden light faded into the horizon of the universe, not extinguished, but woven into every human soul, eternal, quiet, waiting as the final whisper drifted through both real space and the warp alike. Wherever mankind endures, I endure. I was never born, but I will never die. The galaxy had entered a strange silence, not peace, not victory, but the kind of stillness that follows revelation. The tides of the warp, once roaring and wild, now moved like the slow breath of a sleeping giant. The golden light no longer burned in defiance. It pulsed softly in the deep, like a heartbeat that the universe itself had chosen to remember. Humanity was scattered, scarred and imperfect, yet for the first time in its long and brutal history, it was awake. No longer did men and women look to the stars in fear. They looked to them in recognition. The Emperor, though never born, had become something greater than a single being. He was memory woven into the species itself, a living pulse in the soul of every human that refused to bow. His dream was no longer carried by one man upon a throne of gold, but by billions of hearts beating across the dark. On the ruins of Terra, pilgrims walked among the glass fields. The air shimmered faintly, humming with unseen energy. There, in the dead center of the planet, where once stood the ashes of cathedrals and palaces of war, they built nothing. No shrine, no temple, only silence. For they knew that to worship him would be to misunderstand him. He had not asked for worship. He had asked for remembrance. And so Terra became the first world in human history dedicated not to gods, but to memory. Every soul who stepped upon its surface was required to speak aloud, a single act of courage, not in his name, but in their own. These confessions, billions upon billions of them, filled the air like invisible prayers. Together, they formed a chorus so vast that even the warp trembled to hear it. The Chaos Gods could still feel that song, and it filled them with something they had never known, hunger mixed with dread. Khorne raged. For every act of courage that did not demand slaughter was a blade turned inward. Nurgle wept, for hope denied him infection. Slaanesh shuddered, for contentment was poison to desire. And Tzeentch the eternal schemer smiled, for he understood before the others did. The game was not over. It had never been. For even in defiance, even in selflessness, even in faith without gods, there lay the seed of chaos. The light that gave humanity strength would one day tempt them to rule again, to conquer again, to build empires of salvation and call them freedom. The cycle would begin anew. It always did. But this time, there would be a difference. Because now, mankind knew. They knew that the gods were born from their own fears, their own hunger, their own dreams. They knew that the warp was not hell, but mirror. They knew that to endure did not mean to conquer, and that to believe did not mean to kneel. The unborn emperor had taught them without ever speaking that divinity was not something to be found in the stars, but in the choice to rise from ruin. And that was enough to change everything. Centuries passed. Civilizations grew again, cautious but determined. Ships crossed the void not through the light of the Astronomican, but through the steady pulse of the human soul, a navigation born from empathy and will. The galaxy, once fractured, began to hum again with the rhythm of life. On the edge of known space, a child was born. She carried no mutations, no psychic taint, but when she opened her eyes, they glowed faintly with the color of dawn. Her first word was not mother, but remember. The story spread like wildfire. Some claimed she was the reincarnation of the Emperor. Others said she was merely a child of the New Age, a living echo of the human spirit, proof that the light had not faded. Wars would be fought over her name, poems written in her honor, and yet the truth would remain the same. She was not divine, she was simply human. And that was the final miracle. Because in a universe that had forgotten mercy, courage, and meaning, to be human was the rarest godhood of all. The warp quieted but never slept. It waited, patient, eternal, as it always had. The Chaos Gods whispered still, their voices softer, subtler, weaving temptation into love, pride, and hope. They did not need to scream anymore. They knew that as long as mankind existed, so too would chaos, for they were born of the same seed. But the balance had shifted. For the first time, humanity understood its own reflection. And somewhere within that fragile understanding, within that endless cycle of rise and fall, birth and death, light and shadow, the faintest echo of laughter rippled through the cosmos, not cruel, not divine, but human. It was the laughter of a species that had finally seen itself and chosen to endure anyway. In the heart of the warp, golden motes drifted like dust upon the wind. They coalesced for an instant into the shape of a man, tall, faceless, radiant. He stood upon the edge of infinity, watching the galaxy spin. Then, as the light dimmed, he whispered one last time, a whisper so faint that only the stars heard it. I was never born, yet you remembered me. And because you did, humanity will never die. The figure dissolved into the endless sea of light, becoming indistinguishable from it. The galaxy continued to turn. New suns rose, old ones fell. The great cycle began again. But through it all, through every war, every age, every rebirth, that whisper remained, etched into the soul of all mankind. The Emperor was never born, but his dream, the dream of humanity's eternal defiance, will never end.